We've conducted a study, really inspired by Kelly Anderson's work that you heard about earlier, to look at refugee migration in a different context, in the context of Sweden, where they accept more refugees than any country per capita in Europe. We conducted a study on schizophrenia and non-affective psychosis. I've got a bunch of slides that tell you all about psychosis, so you know about that now, so I'm not going to repeat that. But it buys me some time to tell you a little bit more about what it's like to sort of live with psychosis. And of course, they start early in your 20s and 30s, and then you might live with psychotic disorders for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And of course, that happens just when people have started work, started social lives, and so it's incredibly debilitating and leads to significant disability and years lost to life. I'm only going to be talking about schizophrenia and other non-affective psychosis, so I'm not looking at the affective disorders in the current study. Up next is an artist. This is Brian Charmley, who did a series of self-portraits to describe what it was like living with schizophrenia. And as you can see, it's not a particularly pretty or nice experience. You'll also notice how long Brian lived for, and sadly he took his own life, which is very common amongst people with schizophrenia, and just one of the many problems that we face. So, migration, of course, leads to an increased risk of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. I'd love to elaborate on that more, but I feel like you've all heard enough about that for now, so I want to get to the meat of my talk. One of my favourite pieces of work is by Alex Colville to Prince Edward Island, and that leads us naturally to Paddington. And of course, migration is not a crime, but what is a crime is the fact that migrants and ethnic minority groups have up to 5 times higher risk of developing psychosis, and this is a huge public health tragedy that we need to address and deal with and see if we can prevent that excess risk. So in this study, we looked at more recent refugees and migrants coming to Sweden for a variety of ways, either through being taken from refugee camps and moved to Sweden and rehoused there, or who found their own ways to arrive in Sweden. I will wait for my next slide. So we compared, we took a Swedish baseline population. This should roll through, and we know that the risk in in migrant groups altogether is about 2 times that of the Swedish-born population, but increases to 5 for some groups. Our questions were whether or not refugees showed an increased risk beyond the risk in other migrant groups from the same region of origin. So we asked 2 questions. Were refugees at higher risk of psychotic disorders than the Swedish-born population, who we defined as people born in Sweden to 2 Swedish-born parents, to try and get a kind of more pure baseline of who that might be. And then secondly, whether refugees are at increased risk compared to other migrants from the same region of origin, so those are non-refugees from that region. We took everybody born in 1984, followed to their 14th birthday, and then followed up until the end of December 2011, with migrants arriving in Sweden at any time after that, monitored through that process. We ended up with a population of 1.3 million people, of whom about 3,700 developed a non-affective psychosis. These are the regions included in our study. We included regions where we had at least 1,000 people of refugee status in Sweden. So these were the regions where met that criteria. They were quite broad regions, as you can see: Eastern Europe and Russia, Asia, North Africa and the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So, in non-refugee groups, the risk of schizophrenia compared to the Swedish-born was about double, but for refugee migrants from the same regions of origin, that risk was 3-fold. And when we looked at the difference in risk between refugees and non-refugees, having controlled for income, age and sex, there was a 66% higher increase in refugees, so confirming the work that Kelly's done. We wanted to take that a step further and ask, did that risk vary by the country of origin that people came from? This might be important for several reasons, allowing us to try and identify causal mechanisms, as well as trying to see which groups, when they arrive in Sweden, will be at most risk and who we can potentially intervene in terms of their mental health. Here you can see the rate ratios. The highest rates are for the Sub-Saharan African group, who are 5 times greater risk than the Swedish-born population after adjusting for all those factors, with risks doubled in people from other areas of the world. These are risks for all refugees and all migrant groups compared to the Swedish-born population. This graph really summarizes that. The red line is the Swedish-born population. Everything above it indicates increased risk, and that's highest for people of Sub-Saharan African origin. But interestingly, when we looked at the difference in risk between refugees and non-refugees, that depended on the country of origin you came from. So in a minute, that's going to pop up. And you'll notice in sub-Saharan African groups, although they have massive high rates, the risk between refugees and non-refugees is quite similar. However, for people from Eastern European and Russian backgrounds, the risk is much higher in refugees compared to other migrant groups. So your risk is conditional upon the country that you come from. The big question is why. So we don't know if it's to do with the migration experience itself, which is an entirely stressful experience, dangerous experience often, whether it's to do with the factors that you're exposed to prior to migration, or the factors that you are exposed to after arriving in Sweden. You'll notice that the risk correlated with visible minority status with the highest rates in the sub-Saharan African group, and that might indicate post-migratory factors as well as pre-migratory factors. I need to thank the Royal Society and Wellcome Trust, who are my funders for this, FORT, the Swedish Medical Research Council, and a Swedish institute I couldn't pronounce anyway. So those are my contact details. This is really milking the end of the slides. You can get in touch with me there, find out more about my group's work. And the last slide, which is going to come up in about 3 seconds, is to really ask whether you guys have any questions for me.
So have there been any studies that look at language proficiency and whether one's ability to integrate linguistically with the majority culture has an effect on psychosis?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and of course, language ability is bound up with all sorts of ways of adapting and integrating into a new society. There haven't been many studies, to my knowledge, that have looked at that, but my PhD student's currently looking at that within another European study to look at whether migrants who are more culturally distant, which you can measure through language trees, have an increased risk of psychosis, to try and see if that's one of the factors that maybe increases social isolation or feelings of social stress and unwantedness. We tangentially see evidence of that from Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups living in London, who the excess risk is restricted to women, and particularly first-generation women who probably, on average, speak English to a lesser extent and probably more marginalised both within their own communities and within society at large. And so it's those epidemiological correlates that we now need to get behind and ask those types of questions. Anyway, sorry, am I supposed to? Oh, sorry, at the back.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, is there some possibility for follow-up qualitative work around the stories behind the experiences?
I think it absolutely speaks to that, and Francois and I have talked about that before, and I think you could do some really detailed follow-up work, particularly within refugee groups, to understand their experiences, not just of the migration process itself, which you think must be highly relevant, but also of the factors that they're exposed to beforehand, as well as those factors they're exposed to once arriving in somewhere like Sweden. One of the things we found, which we haven't been able to explain in that study, is that refugees presented to services a year sooner than other migrant groups for their psychotic disorder. So we would have thought they'd be more hidden from services, but actually they presented sooner, to suggest that not only are those stresses more common, but they lead you to the disorder more quickly after arrival. So that might point towards earlier experiences, but it would certainly benefit from qualitative research to answer that.
Great work.
Do we have time for one more? Yeah.
You mentioned at some point that Eastern Europeans and Russians might have higher risk factors than some other communities. Could that be? What would be the reason for that, do you think?
So the relative risk in those groups were raised compared to the Swedish-born group, but that depended on whether or not you are a refugee or non-refugee group in that group. So
are economic migrants, surely there isn't a clear war
in this study
going on.
In this study, that would include people from the former Yugoslavia, so there would have been a lot of people who are exposed to war and so forth.
Yeah.
So I suspect the reason we see a bigger difference between refugees and non-refugees in that group is because the refugees have more clearly been exposed to trauma than the other migrants, who on average are more likely to be economic migrants, not at increased risk.